Hi everyone, Helen Blunden here. Hope you're happy, healthy and well. It is time for a new book review today where I share some of my life lessons out of books that I have been reading. Now, the book that I'd like to share some of my life lessons and a review is one that is breaking apart in my hand, but as you can see, it is Julian Barnes. He's one of my favorite authors whose collection now is one that I am trying to have. So every time I see any of his books in secondhand bookstores, through dusty boxes and dusty bookshelves, I always buy them. Now this particular one was written in 1992. It is his 7th book. It is breaking apart in my hand, and as you can see, it has been sticky taped. It's called The Porcupine, and I want to ask you, do you know this book? Do you know what it's about? Because there's not much out there about this book, and I must admit I did find this a little bit harder to read than his usual books. It was first published in Bulgarian, and I would say that this genre is political fiction. If political fiction is not your thing, and especially about Eastern European politics of the 1990s, then I would say leave this aside because you might not like it. However, if you like political intrigue, if you are across Eastern European politics, if you want to read something that presents, I guess, the theme as I understood it, that regardless of what political side you're on, if you are on one political side one time and your government changes, where you might be a hero in your political party, once government changes, you become a traitor, and vice versa. Understanding these two aspects of that spectrum, you're pretty much on one side of the spectrum or the other. You're neither a hero or a traitor, but ultimately maybe the political parties are exactly the same when it comes out in the wash. Now, I'm going to say it was a bit difficult to understand simply because I don't know about Eastern European politics. And at the time I was reading this book, I was also watching this series. It was a limited series, and Kate Winslet played this exceptional Eastern European dictator. How she too was also navigating the change in her society, and she thought, as she didn't think of herself as a dictator, she thought what she was doing was right by her people. And similarly, the theme here was about a dictator, an Eastern European dictator, who had been leading his countries for many, many years. And his country, even though it isn't stipulated in here, we can assume it is Bulgaria. He believed what he was doing to lead his country was in the best interest of his country. But now that there was a change in government, a government that was trying to get it to become more of a market economy, they put this dictator, Petkanov, through trial because of his corruption, the embezzlement, the murders, and everything that was bad in his country. But ultimately, though, it was very interesting because the prosecutor general, the one who is prosecuting him, also had a part to play in the original regime, in Petkanov's regime, and indeed his father was also an official in Petkanov's regime. And Petkanov, in this trial, would go up against Zelinsky, the prosecutor, and they would argue that they were not better than each other. Whereas one was seen as a traitor, now was seen as a hero, or a hero seen as a traitor, depending on what side of history you were from originally. This was effectively a story about how a country and how a dictator saw himself as doing right by his people when he was in power. But now, as a market economy, as the people now change and shifted into this new, more democratic power, really, were they better off? There wasn't any food in the stores, people couldn't find work, and yet Petkanov would say, well, during my regime, people had work, people had food. How is this new market economy any better than what happened when he was in power? It was really interesting in that sense because it reminded me of what I was seeing in this show called Regime, starring Kate Winslet, which I highly recommend you see because it put into pictures what Petkov was going through in this book in my head, but also it reminded me of another book that I read called Spaceman of Bohemia, which I loved and I reviewed fairly recently on this channel, where his father also was part of an old regime, and it was taking place in Czechoslovakia, and all the difficulties that his father had under the new regime. And it was where, in this book, in Spaceman of Bohemia, where this concept of, you are a hero for one and then you become a traitor for the other once the government changes. I did say I found this really hard to get into. I would say if you love political thrillers, if you love Eastern European politics, if you are a history buff of what happened in Russia and Eastern European bloc of countries in the 1990s, you'll understand this book. This book had a lot of text in it, and I've got a little notebook here, and I've put text, and I've had exclamation marks, wads of text. Especially, there is a part in this book where there are pages and pages where he recounts Petkov's medals, his honours, his the medal list, and it just goes on for pages in very block text, and I found it at times quite tedious to read. I didn't think you needed to have it all spelled out like that, but I think what Julian Barnes was doing was to basically put in our heads this image of what this Eastern European country was like and how they thought and how they put this emphasis on medals and hierarchy and structure, but also the fickleness, the two-timing aspect of the fact that even though this Eastern European dictator was not well liked by his people, all these Western country leaders thought he was the bee's knees. Also, we get quotations from Zelensky's friends, and there's little snippets of their quotes, and it's as if we are watching the television and seeing this trial of Petkov on the TV as well, and then we get these little side quotes coming in from friends that are wry, that are amusing, that are quite cynical, basically explain, I guess, the sentiment of young people towards this dictator. In actual fact, it reminds me of other Julian Barnes books where there's this commentary that comes in from the sides of the protagonists and also their friends, who are also putting some kind of picture in our head of what they think is happening, and which also help us formulate that picture in our head. So he does this from quite earlier on in his work, which I found amusing. How would I read this book? Because I don't think I'm ever going to read this again. And it started to make me think about, well, I'm collecting his books, but there's going to be books that I simply didn't resonate with. Therefore, that means, should I keep it in my collection? So you've got to let me know, especially for those who are building collections of authors, do you keep all their books even though you might not have enjoyed their books? If I was to read this differently, I would say Julian Barnes, I like his books, so therefore I looked at the author and instantly I took it. Then I thought to myself, it's a short book, I'll get through it. But I found it very difficult to get into. So my second question to myself was, it's only a short book. I can read about 150 odd pages. It's no problem. So therefore I continued with it. The third part was, I thought, well, I don't know the history of it. I don't know what Eastern European politics is about. So the third thing I did was I got online and I started to read some Wikipedia pages and also some articles like in The Guardian that talked about this and mentioned that it was actually about Bulgarian politics. And then I started to really look into some Bulgarian politics and learnt about Zhukov. And again, I thought to myself, is it enough to hold me to read this book? But it was enough for me to continue reading this book. I didn't leave this book aside, but I did find myself not reaching for it as often simply because of these themes that I found difficult to understand. Those were the approaches I made to try and get through these 150 odd pages. So that is my review and my life lessons for Julian Barnes' The Porcupine. I'm going to sit and think whether I want this in my collection or whether I'm going to give this book away. It will mean, of course, that my Julian Barnes collection will have books missing in it. That's okay. It might not necessarily mean that we love every single book from our favourite authors. Thanks for listening and thanks for watching. Bye for now.